many of you know that I've taught for quite a while, and whenever you get a question or an opportunity to speak on ethics, the last thing somebody wants is a professor that thinks they know it all, a professor, especially from UW-Madison, that think they know it all, and supposedly going to tell somebody, well, this, that, the other thing. And I mean, we're all engineers. We like rules. Do this, don't do that. And the world doesn't work that way. So what I'm trying to give you, like when you set up your ladder in the garage, there's a warning on the ladder, like things not to do. So one of the warnings in this is I don't know everything. I'm on a journey, just like all of you in this area of ethics. And so if you've heard me speak on this before, I use the language towards ethical practice intentionally, because the active verb of towards meaning is that we're leaning towards, we're moving towards. It's not fixed in time. And so the notion of leaning into this is much different than saying coming here for an hour and wanting dispensed 1 hour, under which then everybody says, well, I've met that requirement, or I've got all that. Or one of my favorites is, I would never do that. Okay, this is one of my favorite. I would never do that. All right. I would just simply say, I will not say that, because under the right set of circumstances, the right set of context, the right set of challenges, you might find yourself in a situation to do something that later you retroactively look back and say, I'm not sure. So it's in the spirit of, and I hope you're going to have some questions. So it's in the spirit of us on a journey that I hope I can present a few things for us to think about, engage in dialogue. And as if you have questions, please jump in. So that's the title. I was just home. I grew up in Alliance, Ohio, Northeast Ohio, Canton, Akron, Cleveland. Longtime disappointed Browns fan, but always a Pittsburgh Steelers fan. And, as a young kid, I watched The Wizard of Oz many, many times as a kid. And, so this thing of give me courage, and then, this notion I just mentioned earlier, give me ethics, dispense ethics. I can't do that for you. I can't make others ethical. There's a difference between being or understanding ethics and acting and being consistent in terms of ethical practice. So I think that the key point I want to try to make here is I can't give you courage. I can't give you a heart if you're the Tin Man. But I think the notion of us thinking more intentionally about some of these things, I think, is the work. Or let me say it another way. I think what Rosalind's asked me to do, I'm not here to tell you what to think. I'm here to try to help all of us think about this, right? Think about this, because contextually, it's to me, I think clearly there are some set of circumstances, it's clear, but many, like life, many of you know and lived experience, it's in the gray zone. It's in the gray zone. And it's fraught with a lot of issues. Your individual and personal values, our professional and expected set of behaviors, and then the interface between morality and values and virtues. These things are very individualistic, but then they have a level at which they come to the profession, then they come to us as citizens, and one just has to be, what I would say, more mindful, or at least I would tell you in my journey, to be more thinking about some of these kind of things and these implications, what they might mean, what they might not mean. And I have some just general observations. So again, I'm not here to try to tell you what to do. What I'm trying to suggest is let's all think about some of these things in a more meaningful way. Well, I love this quote because this is my active verb of towards. You never step in the same river twice. And that's what I would tell you about ethical challenges and decisions that we're confronted. You can't, or we can't stop the world. You can't stop circumstances. Things evolve. And so this notion of this active engagement piece is what I'm trying to say. Thankfully, things that we believed in the 1900s are not what we are accepted norms now. Okay. So there's been, so my point is using this as an illustration, this has changed, right? This has changed. And this is a good thing, right? But then there's, with that comes other things that we have to think about. So anyway, so we'll think, never step in the same river twice. Well, here's the goal. Here's the goal. And let me first, as I tried to say on the front end, what I wanted to try to make it clear, I'm not some know-it-all. I've tried to really, when asked to do this, really dig in and try to think about some of these things more deeply. But what's a reasonable goal? To me, it's one thing to be ethical. It's another thing to act ethically, okay? Be ethical in your mindset, your construct, and then be ethical in terms of actual circumstances and behavior. So what's the goal? And so what I was trying to tell you is why I said I would never, I would never say I'll never do that is because I know I'm not perfect. Okay, I'm going to start with that. Okay, because I've got biases. If anything, I tell the students repeatedly, if I've learned anything, and I'm not the oldest, I see Kevin in the room here. There's some other people much older than me, but you learn through experience that you're a walking set of biases. You're a walking set of experiences that whether some are good, some aren't good, and man, you just filter a lot of that. Some of us, me, I gotta be careful with that. So what's our goal? We're not perfect, okay? Let me say I'm not perfect. If we think about what it means to behave ethically, that's important. So we're cognitively engaged on this. It's not a checklist. If we can commit to acting ethically, that's the commitment. That's the aspirational goal. That's what we're seeking to try to do. Why? Because we're in a space, and I'll show you some data, where in fact the public trust matters, okay? That matters. Okay, now you can say, oh, it's fine, I see someone else doing it. Man, I don't know. I mean, public trust matters. So I'm gonna commit to acting ethically. And if I commit, it makes it easier to make the ethical choice when confronted with a set of circumstances. It doesn't guarantee it. Psychologists will tell you, if you write down 3 to 5 things you say you'll never do, the act of writing from your head to your fingers to on the sheet of paper, on your keyboard, helps you kind of say to yourself, these things are important to me. And the likelihood that you're going to do it, it's not a guarantee you won't, but it's the likelihood that you won't, because you're not Pollyannic on this saying it's never going to happen to me. Okay, I would never do that. I've heard people just say that over my career repeatedly. And if you talk to law enforcement people, they'll tell you, if you watch any of these crime shows, all of these individuals, oh, I'd never do that. I'd never do it. Well, I mean, I would just simply say humans are pretty smart. Okay, if you read psychology and social psychology literature, it's pretty full of things about like what people say versus what they do, what they perceive they said versus what they do, how they tell themselves a narrative. I'm pretty good at that. Telling myself a narrative that I want to believe when in fact it doesn't fit the circumstances. Why? Because I would never be racist. Okay. I would never do anything that would discriminate. But the fact of the matter is that one has to be mindful of those kind of things. Implicit bias in a lot of these things. And they're just a reality. So anyway, so the one thing that I've really tried to focus more on the positive side, if I've learned anything in this space, and we're going to talk a little bit about trust, trustworthiness is the first virtue of professional life. That's my observation. You might disagree, but trustworthiness is the first virtue of professional life. To the extent that one is trustworthy, that is like really, really important. And that's why I made the point about the public. I think there's much more at risk around serving the public and in the spirit of losing public trust, not being viewed as a public steward, not being one that's honest and is straightforward. And instead of playing politics and everything in the middle, and by the way, I'm an engineer, I'm not a politician, clearly. Many people would rather know, I don't know, than to stand up and tell them something that like is not, you're not sure. And I tell you, I've studied pretty carefully what happened in Flint, Michigan. And there's a bunch of stuff in that when you start to look at how you manage risk, how you manage a crisis, how you communicate, that is important. It is super complicated. Okay. Those of you, you all know that. But what I'm saying is one's got to think carefully about these things first. And trust is something that, you know, we'll talk a little bit about it. It's a complicated construct. My experience, when I see it and I experience it, I understand it. The question is, I ask myself, and I'm in the middle of a number of things at the university with my two bosses, the chancellor and the provost, am I trustworthy in what I'm being asked to do? Because in some of this, it is not, things are not going as well as I want. So the question is, do you disclose that? Do you kind of, you know, as I heard a good friend of mine once say, you can put lip on a pig, you can put lipstick on a pig, it's still a pig, okay? So, you know, so this kind of thing of, yeah, we'll talk more about that, but I think this trustworthiness is something that's really important. Well, I mentioned I'd show you a little bit of data. That's an eye test for those in the back, particularly you older ones with glasses. I can see some of you might be checking your email for all I know. But you'll see here, the Gallup poll runs a test on honesty and ethics in professions. And they don't have anything specifically in transportation, but I just thought and this is on a scale from 0 to 100. You'll see, and it says, please tell me how you'd rate the honesty and the ethical standards of people in these different fields. Very high, high, average, low, very low. Car salespeople, 9. Okay, this is 2019, and they only do this like every other year, and they don't do all professions at the same time. State governors, 20. Journalists, 28. College teachers, all right, that's me, 49 out of 50. Police officers, 54. You don't have to read the press much to kind of get just different versions, right, of how people are perceiving that. Dentists, 61. Medical doctors, 65. Nurses, 85. Engineers, 66. If you look actually at engineering and you look at a plot over the last 5 years, you would see the slope of that line is positive. There is a high regard on behalf of the public as it relates to the ethics and the standards of engineers. And having just been through a bunch of medical issues with my family, I really appreciate and better understand how important nurses are. Doctors are too. But man, how they're at the point, the point of value creation in the sense of healing, right? They're the ones, the doctors help in the surgery, but so the nurses are the ones that really help sustain some of that. So anyway, so this is interesting, and I think it's hard, you lose it, I think it's hard to get it back. So let's talk about the construct of this. So in other words, what I've found over the years, somebody will say, well, ethics is over here, professional ethics. I'm a member of NSPE or I'm a member of ASCE, and I have an expected code of ethics. But if you look and talk to sociologists that study professions, okay, so the question they're asking is what constitutes a profession? Okay, and they'll tell you it's 3 things. And the sociologists that have studied this, they'll say it's organization, it's an ethic of professional service, and it's a body of knowledge. So let me start at the bottom and go up. A body of knowledge is the assumption that through intensive academic training and real-world experience, you develop skills that make you a professional that has professional autonomy in that space. So that's the key part, is on the body of knowledge. It's a combination of theory and practice, the evolution over time, whereas we learn more, you need both theory and you need practice. My favorite quote from George Box that started the statistics department over 60 years ago at the University of Wisconsin is, all models are wrong, some are useful. Okay, so some want everything to have no risk. As many, you all practitioners know, there is no perfect model. But the notion of theory and understanding systems and understanding models, understanding variable, understanding risk, okay, understanding what's more important in terms of the significant impact on outcomes, that plays in. So theory is important, but on the flip side, application is important, because this is how it manifests itself, how important context is. It'd all be great if there weren't people involved, a lot of this, right? It'd be a lot easier, many of you, to do your job if there wasn't people. So anyways, so the body of knowledge, this professional autonomy, the ability to learn, not just simply be a technician, okay? The difference between a professional and a technician is a technician follows a set of rules, okay? And they comply with the rules. The professional deals with the one-offs, deals with other externalities that one has to consider in that. That's why critical thinking and professional judgment, professional engineering judgment matter, okay? When I'm with the physician and I'm not sure what's going on with my stepmom, I was looking for the physician's judgment, right? Because she had the data. She had the data. Okay, so I'm just simply trying to say the body of knowledge, it's the set of skills, okay, that is really, really important that you can bring to bear. Critical thinking, good judgment, understanding what things should be considered, what things can't. We all practically know you can't do everything. You can't look at every scenario. So you got to know how to reduce the scope of what you're trying to study in terms of the problem. So anyways, body of knowledge. Let me do organization. Organizations means that you have a professional society where what are you trying to do? You don't go just because you want 2 days out of the office or 2 days not to work on work. You want to actively contribute to improving the practice of who you're serving. Okay, you're advancing the practice of what you're doing. So, and you do that through professional associations. You also do it when you have professional, as I said, autonomy. And then there are other elements of that in the sense of monopolies. Engineers, like doctors, like accountants, like lawyers, have a monopoly. Okay, you don't let anybody in to practice that. It's actually regulated. Okay, the state regulates that practice. That's why if you're licensed in Wisconsin and you want to practice in Illinois, you just don't go do that. Now, if you've got comedy, not like comedy making fun, where you can have reciprocity to go there, that's a different story. But there are over 70 different jurisdictions. That includes the land surveyors. Each jurisdiction is different, but the point is the organization, the public wanted protected, that they won't let anybody, and if you know anything about the history of licensing, it started in 1904 in Wyoming over water rights. That's how it started. Why? Because people were being boonswoggled, or whatever the term was, around people representing knowledge in a given area that they did not have. So to protect the public, now many licensing people view this as an obstacle, a barrier to economic competition. It's a way to, it's meant to be a minimum standard to protect the public. It's a minimum standard to protect the public. That's what the goal, and that's why organization matters in this monopoly and this notion of licensure. So if you know anything about the National Council of Examiners for Engineering and Surveying and this whole thing of reciprocity and being an NCES a licensed engineer where you can go anywhere, that whole thing is the profession set that up to set up these minimum standards, okay? And it's to protect. And when you look at that, there is a professional code of conduct that is part of the licensing that you're expected to adhere to, okay? Things like you're not supposed to issue statements that are not true. You're not to practice in areas that you don't have expertise in. There's a whole number of these kind of expected behaviors, professional conduct that one is expected to do. So that's kind of on the organization. Let me get to the ethics. There's 3 elements of the ethics of a professional service. The first one is, it's called the service ideal. Why does the public come to your organization? Why does it come to the WisDOT? Why does it come to the Federal Highway Administration? Why does it come to the Wisconsin DOT? Because you and we have expertise that they themselves don't have. So they are coming because they expect us. Why do you consult an attorney? Because they have expertise of the law, the practice of the law, tort. So that's why, so that's a service ideal. Whom we're serving comes to us because of the experience and what we know. The second element of an ethic of professional service is that you have a codified code of ethics. Okay. Now, if you've studied the code of ethics in detail, you will get some canons and some preamble and all these things that'll tell you, don't do this, don't do that. But the point is, I would say the profession, the NSPE, National Society of Professional Engineers, and ASCE, is an aspirational articulation of how we serve the public and how we as humans interact with others and how we interact with our clients. Okay, we don't disclose confidential information about our clients, for example. Okay, we just don't do that, right? Now, this probably never happened to anybody in this room, but your competitor does one thing. I mean, you're not out openly criticizing that particular individual. So these are the kind of things that when you think about that. And then the third piece in terms of the ethic of professional service, the expectation, and Rosalind was mentioning this, and I have to say it over my career, I've just been struck by how people have been, some, not all, some, have been impacted by the educational process around not loving and being curious about learning. If you're a professional, you're continuing your education, okay, both formally and informally. And because that's what the client expects. I don't want to go to a physician that's using training in 1950 when there's technology much, much better. So this notion of an expectation of a career, and a professional has a career that they continue to build their body of knowledge and their experience through real world experience, but also through formal education, is a requirement. So this is what sociologists would tell us. This is what constitutes a profession. And this is why ethics is important, that it's just not some arbitrary requirement. It happens to be a licensing requirement at the moment, but it comes from the manifestation that this is what constitutes a profession. So what's my practical definition of ethics? To me, it's doing the right thing when it's going to cost us more than we want to pay. It's what we should do. It's not woulda, coulda, bup. It's what we should do. And so a lot of times the tension that one has is what available resources and time they have and how are they going to allocate that. And so, and I've been asked this a couple of times. I haven't been totally on top of it, but I've really thought. So I gave an ACEC talk, so that's American Consulting, American Engineering Consulting Companies, ACEC. And somebody asked me in the back, they raised their hand. They said, well, what things do you, what do you know about engineering that, we ought to be attentive to and this and that? Well, I had thought about that, and I tried to study, and I went to a number of states to look at when violations occur and the state licensing board reprimands somebody licensed, what are the typical things that happen? And normally what happens is somebody that's practicing with an expired license, that's most of it, okay? Or they're not licensed in the state, or there can be sometimes not licensed in a particular area. But so then it had me thinking. So let me just tell you my observation before I forget on the engineering side, what I wonder about. And let me just tell you what I wonder about, because these are things that that I have struggled with myself. The first one is billable time. Okay, what constitutes billable time? Okay, I did consulting on the Miller Park collapse. Come on, man, 400, that's one of the largest claims ever paid out, $400 million. I'm on the phone, I got a call. I think I worked, 15, 20 minutes. Did I work an hour? Now I'm telling you what I'm going through, okay? I'm not trying to tell anybody else. So to me, billable time is one. The other one that I think a lot about is just representativeness in the engineering profession. Representativeness. Are we where we could be? Is the question. I ask myself that all the time. And then the third is, when you look going forward, this isn't to get into global warming or climate change or any of that. Let's just talk about, I was just visiting with a colleague. Let's just talk about variable weather and the impact on structures, systems, and infrastructure, and resilience, reliability. And let's talk about who's impacted the most when those kind of events occur. What does the equity distribution of that look like, okay, over time? And I'm just asking this fair to me are fair questions to think about. So anyways, doing the right thing, even when it costs you more than you want to pay. Well, when we think of unethical behavior, I've said this notion, be ethical versus acting ethically. And I think I'm going to make a parallel here to safety in a minute. But I think that, to me, one of the important things is to really think about the underlying behaviors, So lying, right? Now, I grew up in, I told you, Ohio. My dad ran a construction company. I mean, man, this was just kind of the thing I learned, man, when, yes was yes, no was no. If your no was wrong, you'd go back. If your yes was yes, but turned out to be no, and there was a reason, but you didn't just kind of say, sure, yes, no, this and that. I'm just shocked as I visit with people. It's like, well, you don't understand. I did the best I could, this and that and the other thing. So I think, to me, it's a fair question. What constitutes lying? Is not disclosing something important to the discussion lying? I don't know, but I can tell you, I've thought about that. Particularly when it's something that is important, that you can be putting a veil around something that may not fully explain the context. Again, something to think about. Lying, fraud, okay? Doing something that just falsifying records, falsifying time, falsifying quality reports, falsifying material reports. I mean, all the things that you can think about. Bid rigging. We've had that experience in this state. We know that. It's not just in Illinois. Conflict of interest, sexual harassment, discrimination, bribery, and ignoring public safety. I think in some of these, it's interesting. I went through, so the complexities, I try to make an argument that, that professional conduct is part of licensing. When you have your license, there are a set of expectations. If you go to the WisDOT website, there are expectations around ethics for people that work on federally funded projects. I'm not here if that's for me. Just kidding. So, yeah, I don't. Did we lose the connection? Yeah. So if you go to the WisDOT website, my point is, what you'll see there's some expectations there. Yeah, you might just want to pick up.
The problem is I don't see it anywhere.
Yeah. So anyway, so we'll keep going. So that's one place that you can pick that up. But I was struck when I was going on the Wisconsin DOT website. There's a document called the DOT Employee Handbook, and you might say, I'm not a DOT employee. It doesn't matter to me. Well, but you work with DOT employees, right? So, for example, on page 7, they have 7 and 8, 25 work rules. And it says falsification of records, knowing and giving false information, knowingly permitting, encouraging, directing others to do so, failing to provide truthful, accurate, complete information when required. My point of this is some of these things are codified in things that you don't do. And if you go on further on the ethics, what it says is you don't invite people out for dinner or lunch. Okay. Now, if you're a consultant, you might say, like me, and I look at this and say, come on, man, it's $10, you're going down. But the point is, the reason why that is because they don't want to create a situation where, in fact, it might impair their judgment. Or go to the Packer game. And what I can tell you from firsthand experience, I'm somebody that struggles with that. Somebody takes you out, they do this, you build a relationship with them, something gets on the line, come on. And it's a complicated space as to what are professional relationships and what then spill over into other things that will cloud your judgment, that when you get the things that are complicated, and we're going to talk about one where you have to balance trust with loyalty. That's complicated. Okay. That gets very, very, as a practical matter, complicated. So again, there's just some things to think about. My point with this is you can look in the handbook and you'll see things. And my hunch is many people haven't really looked at that. And I would just encourage one to look at it because it'll remind you of certain things that you want to think about. So things in there like when you talk about harassment or discrimination, you're not to be using foul language and harassing people in the workplace. It's not only a federal law, it's not only a state law, it's like embedded in the culture of the DOT. You're not to do that. And if you're on their job, you're part of their expectations as it relates to that. So I think, again, these are some things to actually think about. Now let's talk about, I'm going to make the connection. If you read, and I've tried to be a student on understanding safety, and I do think that we all have a moral obligation on all our projects to be as safe as we can. We want everybody that goes to the work goes home safely. We want everybody, the traveling public through, we want them to be safe during the construction or whatever the renovation is, and after then the utilization of it to the extent we can. To me, the important thing here is I'm after unsafe acts. It's after thinking about that as a context. It's not unsafe conditions. The environment clearly can contribute to that. The culture can contribute to that, right? The safety culture and that, but it's the acts that create the problem. And I'll make the same argument around the culture as it relates to ethics. But this is just something, you know, most people don't realize it. If you look at the big four, being pinched, electrocution, it's falling 6 feet or less are where most of the safety accidents happen, to include at home, by the way, to include at home. So safety, I think, is a key one. Well, let's talk about ethical behavior. Professional, report wrongdoing, that's hard. That's very difficult, it's complicated. It might academically sound like it makes a lot of sense, but if you study, and I've looked at a number of the whistleblowers, that's not easy. That's not easy. And you got to understand the set of circumstances. Fair and objective, self-aware, focus on safety, honesty. I've tried to mention, you know, trustworthiness, forthrightness, these kind of integrity, those kind of things that play into that. So these are some ethical behaviors. The realities are most people behave ethically, you know, so this is, don't take what I'm trying to say that everyone is unethical. That's not true. Most of us day in and day out strive to be ethical. Okay. Now, have I been ethical? Back to when I said, am I perfect? No. Have I been ethical in all circumstances? I can't look at any of you in the eye and say, yes, I can't do that. Have I learned some things? Have I made some mistake? For sure. Are there grades? You know, is there some gray zone? I think so. Are there varying levels that some are more impactful than others? I think so. I think so. Yeah. So, you know, most behave ethically. All right. So I mentioned ethical tensions. This is, again, this doing the right thing, even when it costs you more than you want to pay. If you look at some of the literature, and I'll explain one of the authors here in a minute, trust versus loyalty is a complicated one for me. I want to trust somebody, but then there's a question of loyalty. Okay, so this is the example that I've had that I use is, or at least for me personally, and I've got to get my phone out here. What time is it? I'm a little worried I'm going long on. What time is it? Huh? 11:05. Oh, I thought she said 11:30 already. All right, I'm just getting warmed up. So no, just kidding. We go to 12:30, right? Just kidding. Just kidding. Just kidding. So the trust versus loyalty one to me is, I mean, let's talk about substance abuse. And it's somebody that you know. It's somebody that you've worked with a long time. Okay. It might be even a family member. You have a tremendous amount of loyalty to them. And the question then is, what do you do? What do you do? What do you do when they're having a substance abuse problem in the workplace? Or they need money for they might have a sick child, a sick parent, and they're taking things from the office. I mean, these kind of things. How do you deal with somebody that's been incredibly loyal, you're loyal to, you have personal relationships, but you also have to you got to deal with trust, okay? Individual versus the community. I mean, I'm overstating. I ponder this one a lot. The country is founded on individuals. But then the question is, what constitutes community? And am I what are the implications for me in community when I impact other people? Okay, words I use, language I use, inclusion I use or don't use, all those kind of things. I don't know. I mean, that's what I'm thinking a lot about, right? And when you have people, my observation, at least in construction, which I know something about, when you bring somebody that doesn't look in most disciplines, most trades, that's not a white male, and they're like the one or maybe two, man, that's a rough ride. They ride, they're very difficult, most places, very difficult. You look at the iron workers, and I've visited with some of them, some of the women that have tried to work in that field, not easy. And so then the question I ask all of us is, if we know all that, what are we doing in our leadership role to create a more positive environment for that? I'm talking about leadership now, okay? To include at the field, to include in the office, all those other kind of things. So the issue of the individual versus community. Short-term versus long-term, this is my sustainability a bit argument. How do you deal with the trade-offs now versus more the long-term? We don't have unlimited money to do everything. How do you think about that? How are we our best client's agent on that in terms of thinking about some of that? That's also people development too, right? The short-term versus the long-term element. How do we think about their development? And then justice versus mercy. You know, justice in the sense, man, by the book, follow the rules. Then the question is, well, wait a minute, you know, I mean, is that true all the time? Is that contextually true? Is it illegal? All these kind of things. I think it's, again, stuff to kind of think about. So the way this works is, as you think, this is this author, Kidder, talks about care-based thinking, ends-based thinking, and rule-based thinking as a way to triangulate on that. And there's a tension there. Most of us, I would say, the engineers in the room, most of us like rules. We like it very clear. Do this. Why? Because if you think about ethics, it creates a standard. And that's one of the things, if you talk to psychologists, philosophers, what philosophers will tell you is the big challenge on morality and moral standards and that, it's a whole question is, where's the standard? What is the standard? Where's the standard come from? And who does the evaluation, whether it meets or it does not meet? And by the way, in that, the standard is right versus wrong. Okay, right versus wrong. So when you think about normative ethics, the philosophy field, they study this very carefully. And the big question is, what's the standard? And how do I attain moral knowledge? How do I learn about those kind of things? Where do they come from? Some religious say it comes from God. Others say it comes from the community. There's everything else in the middle of that. But I think some of that plays in to this in terms of how one might think about it. So anyways, why do people make unethical decisions? I think a lot of it comes down to pressure and decision making. There's just a lot of pressure. Pressure from our peers. When a good case study, look at how Enron, you know, the fair company doing all this stuff, had this veil of public service. You looked underneath that stuff, it was complete fraud. And a lot of that came by other peers, Harvard grads and all these top, you know, supposedly educated people, influenced by others that said, you know, that's probably all right, because then you get to the community piece. How do you think about that? Right? That's what I think makes that hard, is how do you think about those kind of, so your peers, what psychologists tell us is we think about role models and we think about our peers that will influence our behavior. A lot of them, that's what they'll say, the social psychologists. Authority, do you have the power? There's a lot of embedded power that many of us have in our roles in the organization or on a project. How do you think about that? How's that communicated? How does that influence how people think about things? What your role is, and then time. I mean, there's no question we're in the business where we have a lot of pressure on time. You don't have unlimited time. You don't have unlimited resources. So these are just some things to think about. So anyway, so pressure by intensity, violation of the law. Over my career, what I've observed is, hey, wait a minute, if it's legal, it's ethical. I've heard some of those arguments. If it's legal, it's ethical. Well, you got to ask yourself, clearly there are laws. You just tried to make the case in, you know, sexual harassment or harassment discrimination. There are federal, state, local laws, you aren't to do that, DOT things, but then the question is, when you go all the way over, you see these other things. We want to keep our job. We want to make our boss look good. We've got our own obligations, and then, the project budget and timeline. There's just a lot of, this thing of how we disclose what we know when there's a lot of pressure around budgets and around time, I think is a real art form. Because there's politics and everything, right? One's got to, they don't want to go in and tell the secretary of the DOT, well, we're going to blow our capital budget by 60%. Kevin, if you were doing that when you were running things, that might have been a short conversation. There are some practical things that one has to think about. I just want to make the point here, you can't read all this, but my point is, this is based on a study where they look at ethical violations, what's observed versus what's reported. And I just want to make the point, abusive behavior is ranked 1, but reported 24th. And a lot of people get passes on that. They get passes on that. And so, and I've been part of that. And so you might say, that's why I'm not going to tell you I'm perfect. And I stood by and I let somebody else get hammered. And I just, did the old engineering thing, look down here, look up here. Bystander, okay? So on some of these kind of things, when they happen, that's this point of the moral courage. I'm not trying to tell you what you should and shouldn't do, but I can tell you what I've done. A lot of times I could have said, hey, I'm not sure that's cool, man. Why don't we, you don't have to take everybody on in the world. You can help diffuse situations, diffuse them. This is this individual versus community. If no one else is kind of their advocate to kind of help, and they're different and they're getting hammered, well, how do you think they feel? They don't want to come back for sure. Just like any of us, I think, would feel. Conflict of interest 2 versus 21. I think that gets to be a tough one, particularly if you read the WisDOT report, and many of you that are in higher positions, it's not just you, it's your family members. It's disclosure, financial disclosures. It's a lot of stuff, okay, that if you haven't read and really, if you haven't, it might be instructive to do that because there are a lot more expectations on us in these roles than you might think. And this thing about I never knew that, I don't know if that's a good defense, but safety issues, wasting company resources. This one here, lying to employees, lying to subcontractors, lying to owners, discriminating against employees. These things to me just suggest we have opportunity, right, to work on that collectively as a profession, as a community. So what kind of practical advice? Well, I told you on trust, I was going to try to cover things. To me, what is trust? Trust is giving something that is important to you and making it vulnerable to someone else's actions. That's what trust is. Something now, maybe some of you do, you might have a nephew, some of you might have kids. It's like giving your kid or nephew to somebody, okay? Are you putting them in somebody, that's to me trust. Do you trust them? Are they going to do the right thing? They're going to be a good steward. They're going to take care of them, those kind of things. So that to me is trust. So you need sincerity, reliability, competence, and care. And this is hard to read, but I want to just make 2 points as it relates to practice. And engineers love 2x2s. Trust is competence, okay? Are you competent? But it's also a character. So on the y-axis, trust is character. On the x-axis, trust is competence. If you're high competence, high trust, you're in quadrant 4. Okay, high trust is in terms of competence and characters, module 4. If you're in 4, where it's low competence in low character, it's just not going to work. I have had these kind of experiences of trying to get something, and if you can't trust somebody, I don't care how competent they are. It makes it very, very difficult to get where you want to go. And there is no amount of competence to cover for character issues. The people that just they aren't who they say, they're in the lean world, if you know anything about that, reliable promises, those kind of things. When you're in a human interdependent system where your commitments make the whole system work, it doesn't work. You can't function without somebody that is not going to be of high character. You can't compensate for that. So I like the trust dividends versus the trust tax. If you look at world-class performance, it's high degree of collaboration, effortless communication, positive relationships, and there's the opportunity to be creative. People can share things without feeling like it's going to be retribution later. And that's on, it's a dividend. If it's a tax and everything's, the biggest thing I've seen is, well, I know things, and I've seen this in how people operate. Some people manage because they want to control information. The more they control, the more power they think they have. And that's just a hard way to build trust. It's a hard way, because then you're always wondering about, like, am I being played, right? Am I being honest? Is this like what's really going on? So the tax, it just, hidden agendas, letter writing, that just, to me, is not work. So let me just give you a couple of examples here, and then we'll take questions. So role models matter. So for me personally, I think of like certain people that, like, right when I'm on the cusp, if I can, I'm not saying I always, but if I can, and when I'm confronted with something, step back. Now I'm going to make the counter argument, step into ethics. In some circumstances, the best thing to do is step back. You need distance, the process. And so then what happens? Well, then I think about, like, for me, one of my mentors was Oscar Bolt up in Appleton, Bolt Construction. Have you ever heard of it? Man, this is the old days. I just couldn't, and could not. If I got a phone call from him saying, "You did what? You did what?" Right? So that's how I think about it. So who's your role model? How do you think about it? Sometimes it's a question of, like, it's not stepping in, it's stepping back. It's stepping back, getting distance. Communicate the value of ethical behavior. In my judgment, ethics is a bit like religion and politics in today's world. You just don't talk about it, right? Nobody wants to talk about it. No, I can't do it. Well, because, yeah, we might disagree. Well, I mean, how do you talk about value conflicts if you can't kind of talk through some of that? And it's not to put a fork in somebody's eye. It's just to say, like, hey, let's talk about this. What's this mean? What's this mean? So I think this communicate. Social psychologists tell us what you continually reward is the behavior you'll continue to get. What you don't reward, you won't get. And so I think as you think about that, what institutional structures and systems and things we have in place are we rewarding behavior that might not be what we want? We got to think about that. And then being clear about, like, nope, that's not acceptable. It's not acceptable. But with this notion of restorative piece, right? Now, there's lines, right, where it's like not the case, but there's a restorative piece of trying to understand. Include ethical consequences in decision-making. I'm just surprised how many organizations in today's world aren't thinking more clearly about this from a risk management and a brand management kind of, because in today's world, it only takes a couple of things and stuff will just totally, they just, and it can even be the total wrong narrative, right? And I'm not saying manipulate the narrative, but you better be clear that others are trying to change the narrative in a way that might not be good. It doesn't help us as a professional, right? Encouraging the taxpayers to give us more money, raise our gas tax. Okay, well, do they trust us? Okay, do they think we'll be a good steward? These are good questions. Then share culture, sound ideals, beliefs, and values. So I think this, to me, is more of the discussion. So I like the spider chart here, and I'm almost done. To me, not all decisions are equal. So usually in this discussion, everybody, you're teaching a class, you'll talk about the challenger, and that's like 37, 38 years ago. Very, very few of us are like in the room, in the control room, like the decision is going to immediately have implications on the death of 8 people like that. But when you think about criticality, you can think of it many lives, single life, essential functions, comfort. You can think of it that way. What kind of decisions are we making that have long-term safety consequences for the traveling public, for example? How do we think about that? If you're on the construction side, which is kind of one of my favorite, and you're doing cut and cover work, and you go around, you see the job, and you see that they're not shoring the trench. Well, I mean, come on, man. 1,000 people are killed in construction every year. A lot of it is trench collapse. That's just not good, safe practice, period. I'm the engineer of record. I'm not managing safety. That's what I would go back and say. That's right. But that's what's happening is not right. Somebody's got to say that act is not right. Okay. And protect that worker that's down there that probably has a family. When it collapses, that's the consequence. The time scale, immediate, short term, long term. So not all decisions have the same time scale. What I'm trying to suggest in a lot of cases, when you're not sure, and I would say to me, my lived experience is we all have intuition. Okay, some will call that a gut feeling. If that comes up, don't ignore it. More times than not, when I've ignored that, I've been wrong. If something like, I don't know, then to me, step back. Because a lot of times people that are trying to like maneuver, particularly with a lot of time pressure, no, we got to do it. Why? Because we're behind schedule. We got to do it. We got this and that. So then you'll go ahead and do that. Something will happen. By the way, you'll have to redo the work. Oh, wow, we have time to do it twice, right? As opposed to in some case, I don't know. So the time scale, the relationship between the decision and the possible impact, leadership and culture, none, some, and strong. A lot of the leadership studies show the evidence that when people in an organization know that the senior leaders are committed to ethical practice, it has a stronger influence on how decisions are made at the other levels. Can you guarantee it all the time? No, but it is true. It is true. It's been measured. So the culture, the leadership and the culture, and then to me, workplace climate, positive, neutral, negative, that's how we interact. Now that's the senior leadership, but that's also how we interact as peers, as colleagues, right? And how do we hold each other to a standard that is appropriate for the profession and for what we would want to do. So I ask questions like this: whose standard of care? What's the problem? Are ethics absolute? Are all situations equal? Have accepted business practices and risk changed over time? These things that have changed, kind of how we think about them. I don't know. I'm just asking questions. These are things when I can't sleep at night, which as I get older are more frequent, I just ponder, I just kind of wonder. So these are things you might want to ask yourself. Is it right? Is it fair? Am I hurting anyone? Would I disclose this to the public? Would I tell a family member? Does it pass a stink test? This is Professor Laura Nash at MIT. So let me end where we started. To me, the goal was not to give you a button, not to give you an ethics pin, but to kind of say the goal is that we recognize we're not all perfect. We're going to work to commit and think about what it means to commit to practice ethically. And we're going to do the best we can to practice ethically. So with that, I'll stop. And if there are a question or two, do we have time for questions or not? So I have my email. If you have questions, there'll probably be a question. How do I sign up for the form and get your PDHs? And I think that Rosin will take care of all that stuff for you. But questions or things you maybe didn't agree, or you have other observations, you would add additional comments. This is usually complicated. Yes, go ahead, Kevin. And I'll repeat what you say.
So in our business, it's all about relationships.
Right.
You need to build relationships with the client, with the staff, etc.
Go ahead and use it. Go ahead and use that because we got people online. Yeah.
But in this scenario with ethics, it's a fine line between professional relationship and personal.
Yeah. Yeah.
So give us examples of how you do it, how you can do it, because that's what we're all striving to do correctly.
Right. No, I think that's a great question. And you might not like the answer that I give you, but so the point here is professional and then personal relationships, and relationships matter. I have a lot of different relationships. What works for me is to wall off and say, I have work relationships, but they are not my friend relationships. And that's just me. Why? Because I can't commingle two different things. Because when I'm over at somebody's house and, I'll have a beer or something, but it's not like I'm drinking a bottle of scotch or something. But the point is, when you're in these kind of things, it just creates a different dynamic that I think moves one closer. And I would even go a step further. I might, well, not might, I occasionally take someone out that worked with me, meaning a direct report to lunch, but otherwise I never socialize with them outside, period. And the reason why I do that is because I can't manage that. Okay. Work has to be work, and these other things have to be over here, because I like people. I like to please people. I like relationships. It gets complicated. It gets complicated. So that's kind of my take on it. And others might have other suggestions on this. I mean, another way to do it is to try to involve other people in projects that might involve that person, meaning in terms of not having a direct relationship. I mean, I just had a conversation with a colleague that, had an estate. So, well, let me just say this fictitious. My parents are getting older. So you have an estate, and now all of a sudden you have an attorney, and then that attorney, somebody says, well, write in a chunk of the estate for you. Well, to me, that is a complete conflict of interest, because they're going to benefit by executing the will. And that's what I'm trying to say here, is that if there are like serious work-related implications that are going to play out, to me, then the question is, can you get somebody else to kind of do that? But other practitioners in here, what do you think? Kevin always asks hard questions. Go ahead, Don.
I just had a question relating to what you said there about compartmentalizing.
Yeah.
Because let's say, for example, you're out golfing with your buddies that you work with. Maybe it might be from another company or whatever. And, maybe that person might do some unethical things.
Uh-huh.
And then you get back to the office, and then you get a call from that person the other day. Let's work together on a project. So when you compartmentalize, do you say, because he did this unethical thing over here, it's okay to work with that person professionally, but, is that how you compartmentalize? Or
Well, I mean,
you just say, because you did this bad thing over here, I'm not going to work with him at all.
Well, but let me back up and try to dissect this. What I would tell you is on the philosophy side, what they would tell you is that there frequently is gossip, and there frequently is things that go on like that some people might be saying is idle. And the question is, do you disclose that to someone else? So this is the question: are they morally obligated to do that? There's a bit of some of this in this too. How honest are we with people when they ask questions? So do we maximize our utility of benefit and happiness, or do we minimize pain and suffering? And a lot of times I've been asked different things, and I've not said anything. The reason being, I don't want to hurt them, right? And it's also my disposition. I don't feel like that's kind of my thing. There gets to be a line of like, wait a minute, this not. Now, if it's something they did that was illegal, then to me, what I would tell you 10 years ago, 15 years ago, I probably, I mean, a common one to me, I mean, I'm not proud of it, but, I was known to be able to drink a few beers in my day. And, oh, come on. Yeah, I can easily drive home under 6, 8, 9, 10. You got to be kidding me, right? And so, but the question is, if I'm a real good friend of yours and that, you're like, no, you're not driving, right? That's hard. That's really, really hard. I mean, at least, from where I sit. So what I'm trying to say now, my third point on this is, to me, my observation is, lived observation is, when you start to see chinks in the armor, watch out. It's not just going to be there. You're going to see this somewhere else. That's my observation. Now, does that mean that I feel like I'm a police quote unquote officer and monitoring somebody's behavior and they do one thing and therefore they're dishonest and that's not true either, right? So, but I will say that, 2 points make a line. You got like 4 or 5, you can start to, that whole thing of like, can people change behaviors? Like, and some of this is that point of what I was trying to tell you, self-aware. Some are just not self-aware of it, but I'm just simply trying to tell you my experience. These are like super complicated things, right? And I'm just telling you from my perspective, but lived experience. But what else? Other questions? I know some of you. Wow, this is a snoozer. Go ahead. Just kidding. Just kidding. Just kidding. Yeah, go ahead.
Question about your observations. Since you work with the younger generation, do you notice a difference in ethics between college student generation and?
Yeah, I mean, I that's a great question. So the question is, do you notice a difference based on age? Well, I'm not in the classroom as much as I used to be. I mean, I interface some. Don and I were just talking about this. So, I mean, I think I am becoming the person I said I would never wanted to be. And that isn't like, we're in school, these two young guys here. Oh, yeah, look at this guy. He's kind of, I mean, I'm just, and I don't know, it's because I'm like, more conservative, older. I mean, in the sense of age wise, conservative, this and that. I'm not talking politically, just like, I don't have a lot of runway in front of me as compared to when I was 25. So I see the world a little bit differently. I think that there's a lot of different perspectives on some of this. Some of it is really good. So Don and I were just talking about work-life balance. I think some of the folks that have other things than just their identity as a professional is a good thing. But the question of it is back to like public trust and doing what needs to be doing. Sometimes the way you learn it, like you got to get it a little bit once in a while. I'm not saying 80 hours a week, but this thing of like showing up at 8 and leaving at 4, that isn't the way the world works. I mean, in the sense of like really the mastering and the professional kind of piece. So I think there's some tensions in there. I think there's a lot to be learned from the younger generation and then have those discussions. And by the way, let me not just say that, but I would say a much more diverse generation than a monolithic. I mean, the world I came from was white, middle class, and kind of that was my worldview on some of these things. And I think thinking about some of these things, whether all of the elements of diversity, equity, inclusion, and belong, all elements of that, religion, all of those kind of things, I think are really, really important because to be an educated, I mean, to make this is a personal view, to make democracy work, you have to have an educated civilization. And you have to recognize that although it is characterized now that politically it's intention, look, if you go back 150 years, that's not much different. It was incredibly complicated then in different things. And so I think that's a good thing. Let me just make one final point, and then we better end. The one thing I will say, so back to this thing about the generational thing. Some of you are old enough in the room that you likely weren't born, but you are close enough to know World War II is not that far behind us. That's not that far behind us. If you look carefully at the role engineering played in Germany, it is not a good story. So all I will say, this is why I'm saying, like I would say, we have to be vigilant and mindful of how we choose to use our knowledge, skills, and talents to help advance the public good, advance society. And I mean, I think there are signals out here, at least from where I sit, that should at least have some of us that are a little more senior saying, hey, we better be paying attention here. Because particularly now with technology, I mean, just look at what Google's doing. Look at this chat feature now, this kind of Web 3.0. Look at what happened at VW. Look at what's going on at Epic. When I say all that, I'm not saying all of that's wrong. I'm just simply trying to say, I mean, the role of any technology, if you talk to historians, any technology has limitations and has some unintended negative consequences. Any technology. So we can't just be so naive to believe all this stuff's going to sort out. So I'll stay if you have other questions. You've been a great audience. Good luck. Thank you.